The clock read 5:12 p.m. when Frank Delaney slowed his car to pull over onto the dusty shoulder of Highway 601. The afternoon was muggy. The still air felt like it was sticking to his skin, and the sun still cast long shadows across the hood of his aging 1984 navy blue Ford, the same car he'd kept immaculate since retiring from the Army. Beside him in the passenger seat, Margaret adjusted the strap of her purse on her lap, checked her papers for her appointment, and glanced at her watch with quiet concern. It was exam day. Another one. Maybe the most important one. And she didn't want to be late. The song still playing on the radio, Only You, seemed to contradict the tense atmosphere that had suddenly set in. Because in front of them, about 30 meters away, a police checkpoint had formed. Vehicles stopped in a zigzag pattern. Orange cones, lights flashing unnecessarily. Everything there smelled of exaggeration. And Frank could feel it in the air. It wasn't an old man's intuition. It was experience. As soon as the car stopped, a young police officer, his uniform still starched as if he had just left the gym, approached. He didn't say good afternoon. He didn't ask if they were okay. He simply pointed his finger at the window and ordered, "Documents. Now." Frank, in his reserved manner, slowly lowered the window. Margaret, always kind, smiled and began to speak. "Office." "I spoke to the driver, ma'am." The cut in her speech was dry, cold, and what came next was even worse. The policeman didn't wait for the documents. He walked around, opened the back door without permission, began to examine the interior of the car, pulled the seatbelt, and forced the glove compartment lid. Margaret flinched, frightened. "We are going to a doctor's appointment. My husband is taking me to the hospital. I have cancer, sir. We have an appointment." But what she got was sarcasm. "Everyone has a sad story, my lady. It's no different for you. Have you ever felt like you were being judged? Even though you didn't do anything wrong?" Frank felt it, but he didn't show it. He looked at the young man with the determination of someone who has faced deserts, grenades, and farewells. His deep-set blue eyes held the story of a man who had sacrificed years of his life for his country, and who now saw the woman he loved being treated like a fraud by someone who didn't know the value of what she carried in her uniform. His silence was thick, and every second that passed felt like an endurance test. Her seatbelt was loose. "That's a ticket, sir," said the police officer, returning to his position next to the door. Frank then slowly reached into his jacket, pulled out his weather-worn leather wallet, and took out a card. It wasn't a driver's license. It wasn't an ordinary document. It was a military identification card with the coat of arms and a name engraved in bold letters, Sergeant Frank Delaney. The policeman looked and laughed. That's worthless anymore. The war ended a long time ago, old man." Margaret narrowed her eyes, not at the words, but at the sound, the shape. The way it reduced decades of sacrifice to a mockery, but no one there, absolutely no one, knew what that name carried. Neither did the young police officer, neither did the other Blitz agents, not even the curious who stopped to watch. Because Frank Delaney's name was not just any name. It was etched in pages of history that few knew, and in memories that would never be erased, including one very specific memory that was about to find him again. Stay with me. Because what happens in the next few minutes could restore your faith in justice, or remind you that honor never retires. And just when it seemed like the humiliation couldn't get any worse, a new vehicle approached, with someone who would completely change the course of this story. Frank stood there, standing beside the car, his hands lightly resting on the hot hood, feeling the heat of the metal rise through his fingers as if to remind him that he was still alive. But what really hurt wasn't the heat. It was the bitter taste of being treated like nobody's business. Margaret, in the passenger seat, was clutching the strap of her purse to her chest so tightly that her fingers were already beginning to tremble. And then came the sentence. "Funny? Every time some old people stop in an old car, there's always a story about cancer or illness to move us, right?" The officer's tone was mocking, as if he were joking in a bar, not in front of a woman undergoing cancer treatment. Frank didn't move. He didn't take another deep breath. He didn't fight back. But inside, something old, dormant, began to stir. The same feeling he'd felt decades before, when he'd first entered a combat zone and watched a friend get knocked down by a piece of shrapnel that he'd never forgotten. This public humiliation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. There were no gunshots. There were no explosions. Only words. But each one seemed to hit him in the chest like a bullet that doesn't bleed on the outside. Margaret looked away from him and tried to hold back her tears. But it was too late. One fell. Just one. And Frank saw it. Have you ever watched someone you love get hurt in silence? When there's no scream, no defense, just embarrassment cutting through everything like a thin blade? Frank has. And that to him was worse than any desert, any mission. The policeman drove the car around again. He kicked the back tire lightly. He muttered something Frank didn't quite catch, but it sounded like, "You should ride a bus, not an old car." It was a uniform too tight for so much ego, a badge loaded with ignorance. And yet, Frank stood there, firm, standing, like someone waiting for the storm to pass, without losing his center. Margaret tried again. Her voice was broken but true. "Please, this appointment is important. I'm undergoing chemotherapy. My name is Margaret Delaney. We have an appointment at Camden Hospital. If you want, I can show you the documents." The police officer interrupted without even looking at her. "Ma'am, I've heard this 1,000 times. Everyone here has an illness, an excuse, a sad story. But no one is ever wrong, right?" At that moment, something broke inside her. It wasn't pride. It wasn't hope. It was something more intimate, more raw. As if the last layer of humanity was being ripped away in the face of a stranger with too much authority and too little empathy. Frank lowered his head, but not in submission. It was to contain the wave that was rising inside him, because there were limits, and his were being tested beyond reason. The young man came back with a paper in his hand. He filled it out in a hurry, folded it angrily, and said, "Her seat belt was loose. You'll get a ticket, yes, sir." That moment froze time. Frank looked at Margaret, and then, without saying a word, he slid his hand into the inside pocket of his jacket. From there, he took out what remained of a lifetime of service, his military identification card, already yellowed at the edges, laminated with transparent tape. A card that few people recognized, but it carried decades of history, of sweat, of loss. The policeman took the card with 2 fingers, as if it were a supermarket pamphlet. He read it, and laughed. "Oh, Sergeant Frank Delaney. And what does that change here today? The war is over, Grandpa. That's a thing of the past." Margaret squinted, as if the afternoon light had become unbearable. It was too much humiliation for one day. Frank simply put the card back. He didn't answer, because he knew. There were battles that couldn't be won with words, and yet no one there knew what that name carried, because what that cop was about to discover wasn't on a badge. It was in a story buried beneath silence, recorded only in the memories of a few men, and one in particular. It was then that the sound of a different engine was heard, deeper, louder. A larger police car was approaching from the side lane, its lights on. It stopped behind Frank's car. The young police officer's eyes widened for a moment, still trying to maintain control of the situation. But there was something in the way it arrived that revealed that this was no ordinary reinforcement. The car door opened. A tall, gray-haired man stepped out. His steps were steady. His face was serious. His gaze was direct. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. He seemed focused. He walked to the center of the checkpoint. He didn't say anything. He just looked around. Then his eyes fixed on Frank. There was a strange moment of silence, the kind you feel on your skin, as if the air had stopped. The commander extended his hand. "Sir, can I see your card again?" Frank hesitated for a split second, then handed it over. The man read it and stood still. He held the card in both hands as if it were a relic, and then, in front of everyone, with feet together and chin held high, saluted. The sound was dry, clear. It reverberated all the way to the vehicle's tires. Margaret held back her tears. The young police officer turned pale. The other officers froze. Because right there, in that moment, something had changed. It wasn't just a gesture. It was an acknowledgement. A break in the cycle of contempt. A bow to something that should never have been ignored. And when the commander finally spoke, his voice was as firm as steel. That man saved my life. Now that everything seemed suspended in time, with eyes fixed on Frank and hearts beating faster, something was preparing to happen. Something that would make it clear that what was at stake here was never an old car, a ticket, or a blitz. Comment here, that's not taught in academia. The sound of the paper being pulled from the ticket stub echoed like a slow-motion slap. The police officer, his pen trembling with barely concealed anxiety, scribbled the letters in a hurry, as if he were winning an imaginary race against time. Or against common sense. Reason for violation: loose seatbelt. Vehicle condition: suspected irregularity. Driver conduct: uncooperative. Everything there was a caricature of authority. But what made the air heavy was not the fine. It was the disregard. The contempt wrapped in formality. Frank stood still, his eyes fixed on the policeman's hands, but his thoughts had already gone back years, to when he had faced an ambush in the Iraqi desert. That night, he had lost 2 soldiers, young men, just like that policeman. But back then, they had something in their eyes that he no longer saw. Respect. Even in the midst of chaos, there was unity. There were values. Here, in that blitz, there was none of that. Only the metallic sound of distrust. Margaret was now shaking visibly, not only from the illness that sapped her energy day after day, but from the embarrassment, from the exposure. She was a discreet woman. Always had been. The kind who didn't like to draw attention to herself, who avoided even waving at people in supermarkets. And now here she was, on the side of the road, being treated like a fraud by a stranger with an ego. The policeman finished the ticket with a snap of his pen, tore off the sheet of paper, and handed it to Frank without even looking up. And it was at that moment that the veteran reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out the card. With slow movements, like someone carrying something that still weighs too much for this world, he held the document between his fingers and offered it wordlessly. The gesture itself was a silent narrative. The policeman took the card with disdain. He skimmed it and rolled his eyes. Ah, so you were in the military? Nice. But this isn't a museum, it's a blitz. And here, your name doesn't change anything. That sentence, spoken with an almost cruel casualness, hit Margaret like a stone. She turned her face away, as if avoiding a physical blow. And for an instant, the silence between her and Frank said it all. Because that was not just an insult to her husband. It was a wound that opened up over everything they had lived, over every absence in their youth, over every night she spent awake waiting for letters, over every birthday he missed defending the country. Frank took a deep breath, once, then again. He knew that if he answered, there would be no going back. But he also knew that he didn't need to lower himself. Time would take care of the answer. And it was at that exact second that a different police car appeared on the road. No rush, no siren, no sense of threat. But its presence changed the air. It was as if the environment had stopped spinning for a moment, waiting for what would come next. A man with a firm expression got out of the vehicle. He was in uniform, yes, but with something else in his eyes. Experience. He walked with steps that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He stopped next to the young police officer and asked, in a low voice, to see the card. The young man stretched out his arm without really understanding, handing over the document with his fingertips, as if it were irrelevant. The commander took the card, read it, and froze. His eyes scanned the name carefully. Then they rose slowly to look at the man standing before him. For a moment, no one there breathed. What happened next was unrehearsed. It was not planned. It was not protocol. The commander stood in front of Frank, put his heels together, and without a word saluted. The dry sound of the gesture echoed like a moral thunder. Margaret put her hand to her mouth. The surrounding policemen turned pale, and the young officer who had started it all took a half step back, as if his body wanted to escape its own shame. "Sir, with your permission, allow me to lead you," said the commander, his voice now breaking. Frank nodded slightly, and although his face remained serene, his eyes said it all. Here was a man who carried too many scars to let himself be bent by other people's pride. From that point on, everything changed. The commander took control of the blitz. He gave calm but firm orders. He ordered traffic to be reorganized. He publicly apologized to the couple, and he requested 2 police cars to escort Frank's car to the hospital. Margaret, still not understanding everything that was happening, rested her head on the bench and closed her eyes. It was as if, suddenly, the pain had diminished. Not the pain of the body, but of the soul. The one that no one saw. The one that the words of a stranger had accentuated. The convoy formed, cars made way, and little by little, the image of that old car being escorted by the police became something that none of those present would ever forget. But what no one expected was what was yet to come. Because the story wouldn't end there. It would take on new proportions. It would take on new paths, and it would show that the past, when treated with respect, can transform the present in ways that no one can imagine. Write in the comments. Respect never goes out of style. The police officer's last words were still hanging in the air when the patrol car's radio crackled, interrupting the humiliation with the dry hiss of a direct call. A code was pronounced, and the young officer's response came automatically, almost impatiently. He was still leafing through the ticket, distracted, as if trying to maintain control of a situation that was already slipping through his fingers. Frank remained silent, his hand still clenched, holding the empty space where his military identification card had been, now handed to someone who had no idea what that name represented. Margaret looked away and stared at the horizon for a few seconds. Maybe it was to hide the pain, or maybe just to try to escape that scene. Even if it was with her eyes. The silence between her and Frank was full, dense, loaded with a complicity built over decades of overcoming, but now torn apart by a simple, poorly worn uniform. The cop took 2 steps back, going to the patrol car to check something on the system. He spoke softly into the radio, but Frank could hear. His hearing was still good, his mind sharp. The young man said the full name. Frank Delaney. Then a pause. Hold on. Another pause. Time seemed to hold its breath. On the other end of the line, a deep voice answered with a few words. Short, but decisive. Stay where you are. Don't touch that man again. I'm on my way. The policeman, for the first time, was confused. He looked at the radio as if he had misheard. He repeated the name to himself. He reread the card. And for the first time. He hesitated. But it was only for a moment. He soon returned to his defensive tone. He tried to hide it, but the insecurity in his eyes was beginning to betray him. The crowd around the checkpoint, which had previously just been watching distractedly, was now watching more closely. A lady in a car just behind rolled down her window, trying to understand what was happening. A man in a truck further away took out his cell phone and began to film discreetly. The scene, which had been merely uncomfortable until then, was beginning to take on the shape of something bigger. Frank noticed, and yet, he said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any defense. It was then that the sound of a different vehicle could be heard. A more powerful engine, a more sober paint job. Unlike the others, it was not in a hurry. It had presence. The car stopped behind them. A door opened. A man stepped out, his posture straight, his gaze direct, his uniform marked by time, not by ironing, but by years of command. He didn't look tired, he looked focused. And when his eyes met Frank's, something changed in the air. He didn't ask anything. He didn't ask for an explanation. He just walked straight up to the veteran. The young officer opened his mouth to say something, but was cut off by a simple hand gesture. The commander stopped in front of Frank. And then, firmly and honorably, he extended his hand. "Sergeant Delaney, I have been looking for you for over 20 years. It took Frank 2 seconds to understand. Margaret frowned in surprise. The commander continued. "I'm Lieutenant Jacob Reynolds, Battle of Al-Kifl, 3rd Company. You carried me on your back after the ambush. I was unconscious. And you saved me." There was a moment when everything stopped. Not symbolically, for real. Even the engines seemed to roar more quietly. The young police officer stepped back. The other officers, who had previously pretended not to see the scene, now stood still. Reynolds took a deep breath. He took off his cap, tucked it under his arm, and there, in front of everyone, in broad daylight, in front of the cameras of the curious, saluted. The gesture was as unexpected as it was devastating. The supreme authority of the place, bowing to a white-haired, sweaty man, standing with his body firm, but his heart torn by the shame of minutes ago. Margaret could not hold back the tears. This time, not from embarrassment, but from something rarer. Relief. Reynolds turned to the agents. His tone was direct. "Cancel any fines. End the blitz, and prepare the escort vehicle. Mr. Delaney and his wife have a doctor's appointment, and they will be accompanied." The order was not debatable. As the patrol cars were repositioned, the cones were being collected, and the whispers echoed among the watching drivers. Frank turned to Margaret, and with a smile she had known since she was 20 years old, he extended his hand to her. She took it without hesitation. They got into the car, and then something incredible happened. 4 vehicles turned on their gyroscopes. 2 went ahead, 2 went behind. Frank's old Ford, now in the center, has become an entourage. People were filming with their cell phones everywhere. Some were applauding from inside their cars. Others just watched in silence, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The young policeman remained standing, motionless, with the ticket torn into discrete pieces in his pocket. The commander looked at him one last time, with a firm expression. "Honor, son. It's not taught in a class. It's learned by being beaten by life. And sometimes, by watching." Frank drove with the same serenity as before. But now, something had changed. Not in the car, not in the vehicles, but in the atmosphere. In the value of that gesture. In the lesson that remained. And what happened days later, on national television, would only further amplify the repercussions of that moment that began with disrespect, but ended with reverence. Write in the comments. Honor is recognized, not imposed. The tires were still warm when Frank pulled into the hospital driveway. The 2 escort cars pulled up behind him, and the police officers respectfully stayed in their cars. They stood there, silent, watching as if they were protecting not just a citizen, but a symbol. Margaret, her eyes red and her hands still shaking, adjusted the scarf around her neck and took a deep breath. For the first time that day, she felt like she could walk into a room without fear of being invisible. Frank turned off the engine slowly, as he always did, and opened the door with a care that seemed ritualistic. He got out, walked around the car, and opened the door on her side, extending his hand with the same gesture he had made when they first met, in the early 1960s, when she was wearing a blue dress and shoes that were too tight. Margaret held on tightly. Even though she was weak, even though she was tired, there was strength in that grip. The strength of someone who had endured war without ever wearing a uniform. The hospital welcomed them as if it knew. The nurses, seeing the name in the system and the unusual arrival, looked at each other. One of them, a younger one, whispered to her colleague, "It's the sergeant from the Blitz, the one who salutes." The news had already spread. The video was already circulating. But at that moment, Frank still didn't know what would come next. Margaret's appointment went as it should. Attentive doctor, up-to-date tests. But there was a different tension hanging over her. A feeling that something had been mended that day. Something that had been torn apart in silence for years. Recognition. Hours later, as they were driving home, Frank saw his own image on the TV in the lobby of the gas station, where he had stopped to fill up. It was him, in the center of the screen, next to Margaret. The frozen image of the captain saluting. The headline was straightforward: "The veteran who saved a life and was saved by the truth." The impact was immediate. The story went viral. Within hours, hundreds of messages began to arrive. People he didn't even know. Veterans, children of military personnel, ordinary citizens. People saying they cried watching the video, that it reminded them of their father, that they felt ashamed for having once judged a poorly dressed elderly man in a supermarket queue. It was as if, suddenly, Frank's presence, previously invisible, had become a beacon for many people who live in the shadow of indifference. But with fame came stares, and not all of them were easy to swallow. The media surrounded the house. Reporters knocked on the door. The phone rang nonstop. And the young policeman, the same one who had humiliated him, appeared at the gate 2 days later, with a bouquet in his hand and his eyes downcast. Frank watched from the window for a few seconds, then opened the gate. There was no prepared speech, no rehearsal, just a sincere apology, said in the trembling voice of someone who felt the weight of his own mistake. "I was arrogant and blind, and I almost did something unforgivable. You taught me, without saying anything, what true respect is." Frank listened, his arms crossed, his expression serene but firm. Margaret watched from inside the house. There was still pain in her eyes, but there was also compassion. Frank reached out his hand. He shook the boy's, and he answered, "Respect is not demanded with a uniform. It is earned with humanity." The phrase was recorded by a journalist who was at the gate. The next day, it made headlines. But more than that, it became a motto. It was printed on posters in schools. It was replicated in posts by soldiers. And even the state police department published it on its official profile, along with a photo of Frank with the American flag in the background. Behind the scenes, Commander Reynolds moved what was necessary to make an official tribute happen. The event would be held in Columbia's Central Square, with the presence of the governor, veterans, public schools, and hundreds of people who just wanted to see this man who reminded them of what really matters. Margaret, even while undergoing treatment, insisted on choosing the dress she would wear that day, and Frank, even though reluctant about the exposure, decided to attend for her, and for the many others who, like him, never had their names remembered. But what nobody knew was what would happen on stage. Write it down. Respect is an attitude. The South Carolina sky was different that Saturday morning. Columbia's normally quiet town square on the weekends was now the scene of something rare. An impromptu ceremony, but one filled with intention. Flags fluttered on poles, chairs were lined up in front of a small wooden stage, and a crowd was beginning to form even before the sun had fully risen. Frank Delaney's name blared over loudspeakers, but he, as always, preferred silence to applause. Margaret adjusted the floral scarf over her thin shoulders as she looked at herself in the bedroom mirror. There were circles under her eyes. There were signs of the struggle she was waging against her own body. But there was also a new serenity in her eyes. The serenity of someone who had silently endured pain and now saw her partner's dignity restored in front of an entire city. She turned to Frank, who was wearing the same navy blue suit jacket he had worn on his nephew's wedding day, a suit he wore only on very special occasions. His gaze was calm, but his fingers trembled slightly as he buttoned his cuffs. Not from nervousness, but from memory. During the drive to the location, dozens of cars honked their horns as a sign of respect. On some sidewalks, families held small signs with phrases like, "Thank you, Sergeant Frank," or "Respect is eternal." A child, holding his father's hand, waved excitedly when he saw the car pass by. Frank waved back. This was all new to him, and, in a way, uncomfortable. Because those who have truly lived through war learn not to expect glory upon their return. But there was something there that wasn't vanity. It was justice. Upon arrival, they were greeted by a discreet but emotional team. Commander Reynolds was waiting for them at the foot of the stairs with impeccable posture. When he saw Frank approaching, he didn't smile. He just saluted a second time. And that gesture, once again, silenced the crowd. Margaret walked beside her husband, leaning lightly on his arm, as she always did. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence said it all. It was as if the world had ignored the value of those two all along, until now. On stage, a master of ceremonies began to speak. He told the story of the Blitz. He told what Frank had done in the Gulf, the rescue of soldiers, the international recognition that was never announced. But the most unexpected moment came next. They called the young police officer to the stage, the same one who, days before, had humiliated the couple with rude phrases and gestures of contempt. He came up hesitantly, holding an envelope. His face was paler than the last time, but there was something different there, humility. He walked up to the microphone, looked at Frank, took a deep breath and said, "A week ago, I did what I feared most in my life. I dishonored my uniform. And more than that, I hurt two people who should never have been treated with disrespect. Today, I am here not out of obligation, but out of learning, and out of regret. Sergeant Delaney, Ms. Margaret, I apologize on behalf of all those who have not yet learned the value of listening, empathy, and the story that each person carries in their soul." There was a silence, one of those that makes even the wind stop. Frank stood up. He walked over to the boy, and without hesitation, he held out his hand. "The man who admits a mistake head on begins to write a different future." The handshake was applauded by hundreds of people. Some were in tears. Others just nodded, as if witnessing something necessary, an emotional course correction that few have the courage to face in public. But the most touching moment was yet to come. The state governor took the stage. He didn't talk about politics. He didn't give a rehearsed speech. He simply presented Frank with a special honor, a rare symbolic medal awarded to citizens who have left their mark on the population's memory with silent but transformative actions. To a standing ovation, Frank held the medal with tears in his eyes, but instead of saying thank you, he asked for the microphone. In a firm and unhurried voice, he said, "I don't need a stage. I never did. But if I have the chance to speak today, I want to say something that goes beyond me. There are hundreds, thousands of men and women in this country who gave everything and came back with nothing. They live in silence. Many are alone, forgotten, on the margins. And they don't ask for tributes. They ask for respect. They ask for humanity. What happened to me could have happened to any of them. So if anything has changed today, let it be so that this never happens again." There was no immediate applause. The audience swallowed hard. Then, slowly, they began to clap. At first, timidly, then loudly. The crowd rose to its feet. Margaret, from where she sat, was crying. But this time it was different. It was the crying of someone who had seen, with her own eyes, a hidden truth become visible before everyone. And the most beautiful thing is that Frank left the stage from the side, without seeking the spotlight, without vanity. He took his wife's hand and walked down the steps as if returning home after a duty fulfilled. But when he thought it was all over, something unexpected happened. Comment here. I saw dignity in that gesture. Frank walked slowly down the side corridor of the square, away from the flashes, away from the hubbub of interviews and political greetings. The sun had already set in the sky, tinging the city's ancient walls with gold. Margaret walked beside him, her steps short and cautious, but with a slight smile on her lips. She held his hand with the same firmness as decades ago, as if holding the last thing that still made sense in a world that always seemed too rushed. Behind them, the echo of applause still rang out. People shouted words of gratitude. Children ran with flags in their hands. But Frank didn't turn around. He had never felt comfortable in the spotlight. He knew there were many like him, men and women with stories who would never be given a microphone, but who carried the same weight, the same silence, the same honor. What happened that day wasn't about him. It was about all the forgotten. The car was already waiting for them, parked on the street. A different policeman, older than usual, opened the door and greeted them with a respectful nod. Frank nodded back and got in. Margaret adjusted her purse on her lap and looked at the back seat, where a brown envelope lay. Inside it was the medal from the ceremony and a letter signed by the governor, with nice words, but which, deep down, did not change the past. They only acknowledged what had always existed. On the way back, Margaret broke the silence. I never imagined seeing this. With us. After everything. Frank looked out the window, watching the city pass by in pieces. Storefronts closing, lights coming on, a lady calmly sweeping the sidewalk. He smiled at the corner of his mouth, as if accepting the moment, but not clinging to it. Neither. But it's like in war. Sometimes you think the worst is over, and yet the unexpected finds you. And the unexpected, in fact, was still watching them from the corner. That same night, hours after the event, Frank received a call. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. He didn't like surprises. But something made him press the green button on his old cell phone. The voice on the other end of the line was slow and well articulated. Sergeant Delaney, this is the director of the National Veterans Memorial. We've been following what's been happening, and we'd like to speak with you. In person. Frank hesitated, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. He had never been contacted by any official body since his discharge. No plaque, no diploma, nothing but a mailed envelope with impersonal handwriting and the word "retired" in bold letters. About what exactly? He asked cautiously. The answer came softly. About your legacy, about what has been silenced for so long, and about how your story can inspire a new generation that has never seen a battlefield, but needs to learn what courage is. For real. Frank didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath. Margaret, sitting next to him, noticed his expression change. There was something different there. A doubt, maybe, or just a growing awareness. Can we schedule it? The voice insisted. We can, he said finally. But I'll only go if my wife goes with me. On the other end of the line, the silence was brief, but filled with respect. It will be an honor to welcome you. And so, days later, Frank and Margaret boarded their first flight in years to Washington. Not as tourists, but as guests. The flight was booked by the memorial itself. A motorcade was waiting for them at the airport. The driver, a young African-American Afghanistan veteran, cried as he shook Frank's hand. My father spoke of you. He was also in the 3rd Company. Frank squinted. Old memories surfaced like blurry photographs, but he just nodded silently. The museum was packed, but not for an ordinary ceremony. There, among the cold, silent rooms that held helmets, uniforms, and yellowed letters, a new space was to be inaugurated. The Frank Delaney Room, Honor in Silence. A curator explained to the press that the gesture of the Blitz, the silence, the posture, the military card handed over with dignity, had touched the country more than fiery speeches ever could. And that, in that small laminated card, lay a hidden truth, that honor does not need to shout. Margaret held Frank's hand the whole time. There was pride in her eyes, but also pain. The pain of knowing that it had only come now. Too late for many. Too late for Frank's father. For the friends who never came back. For the ones who came back and disappeared into the margins of society without ever hearing a thank you. The room was simple. But there was something there that no architecture can sustain. Living memory. On the central wall, a phrase in metal letters. Respect is not demanded with a uniform. It is earned with humanity. The crowd fell silent. Someone cried. And at that moment, a child, no more than 8 years old, came up to Frank, tugged at the hem of his jacket, and asked in a pure voice, Are you a real hero? Frank bent down with difficulty, looked her straight in the eyes, and replied, No, young lady. I just tried to do what was right. And in that moment, The entire country understood the weight of those words. If this made sense to you, leave a like, not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign that this conversation was worth your time. And if you want to continue receiving stories that truly touch you, subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't deliver noise, we deliver meaning. Oh, and if you stayed until the end, write in the comments. There are still values that cannot be erased. I will know that you have gone every step of this journey with me. And take advantage, there's a video here that continues along these lines. Click and follow me there. Because some stories we don't hear, we feel them.